Welcome all of you once again to our lecture, and to also say a word of appreciation for Mary Doak. Mary, I learned today, is from Illinois, from the Quad Cities, and is a graduate of Loyola University in Chicago, and she has also taught at my alma mater, which is North Park University, so we have a kind of a kinship as a result. She comes to us from the University of San Diego, where she is the associate professor in theology and religious studies. She deals with areas related to liberation and political theologies of democracy and religious freedom. And maybe she will give us today a theological analysis of the 2016 presidential race. Who knows? Mary, we're happy that you are here with us, and we welcome you and look forward to your sharing.
I might follow Charles Blow's example in the New York Times and refuse to say that name of the current Republican frontrunner who used to be a real estate developer. That's all I'm going to say about the elections. Thank you so much. It is a great privilege, and I feel very honored to be here with you, to be giving the Campbell Lecture on Christian Unity, and in this moment to sort of honor and celebrate the work of the Lehigh Conference of Churches, both on church unity, which is very important, and in service together for our society. And I'm asked to speak on the theology of Pope Francis, which of course is an interestingly potentially unifying and potentially divisive topic on all sorts of levels. I mean, you think back to just the basics of it. The papacy, the ministry of the Pope, is supposed to be a ministry of unity, but of course has been anything but that. That has been one of the main issues we've divided over. So, perhaps his theology, which is being well received in some circles at least, and as well as his humble style, we might find yet again some path to unity through listening to Pope Francis for a few minutes. So most of you will, of course, know that Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who is the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina, was elected on March 13th, 2013, 3 years ago, as Bishop of Rome and therefore the Supreme Pontiff for Catholics around the world. And following custom, he took another name. Breaking with custom, he took the name that had never been taken before, Francis, after Francis of Assisi, in which you might find another impulse to unity, because he's a Jesuit in formation and religious community, a type of priest that is very different from the Franciscan order of priests. So there's also a reaching out, I think, across divisions there. In any case, he's gotten a lot of attention for his fresh approaches to some important topics that I'll say a little more about, but also for his humble simplicity, his warmth and good humor, which is also, I think, worth emulating. So if you're paying attention, as people in my profession have to do, I'm a Catholic theologian, I have to try to notice when he writes things. So if you're paying attention, you see he's actually had enormous output. His publications have been considerable. In his 3 years as Pope, he's published 2 encyclicals. One, of course, was co-written with the former Pope Emeritus. It's a great idea. Benedict, Light of Faith, Lumen Fidei. One on the environment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. His apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, on the joy of the gospel. So we've already got, those are 3 things, those are a couple hundred pages single-spaced if you ever read them, by the way, each. and a book, The Name of God is Mercy. All of that while traveling the world, preaching, giving talks, getting a lot of attention, and running the Catholic Church. He's a kind of busy man. I should be so productive. Anyway, another thing you'll pick up, though, if you listen to the press at all, is he's addressing what might seem to be a bewildering array of topics. I mean, he's getting quoted on certainly his critique of global capitalism, concern for immigrants, interreligious dialogue, global warming, evangelism, clericalism, God's mercy, even walls versus bridges. He's all over the map. Now, I might ask, well, why is he doing all of this? It was easier to kind of focus, the Pope John Paul had a real strong emphasis on human rights, particularly against the Soviet Union. Benedict had an emphasis on Orthodox doctrine, keeping our beliefs clear. Why is Francis doing all of this? Maybe he's not so young anymore. He's trying to get as much done as he can before he dies. Cover everything. But I actually want to suggest here that there's a coherent vision. There's the underlying unity behind all of these different things he's talking about. So I'm going to try to suggest that image to focus our discussion of specific aspects of the theology of the poor. And what I've detected in his writings has suddenly hit me. He's dealing with a very deep Jesuit topic. This is back to his formation in the Society of Jesus, the Order of Priests. They take the spiritual exercises developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola. All Jesuit priests have to go through this, I think, twice in their formation. Many lay people are now doing it. My husband, who is not Catholic, who's Episcopal, took the spiritual exercises for lay people. And one of the meditations, so familiar if any of you have done the spiritual exercises, focuses on the two standards. By standards, by the way, Ignatius of Loyola, who had been a soldier, means battle flags. Two battle flags that we choose between. One, and this will sound like traditional kind of late medieval spirituality here, the standard of Lucifer, which tempts us with wealth, status, pride, and independence on the one side. And of course, on the other side, we're invited to follow the standard, to fight under the battle flag of Christ, which calls us not to wealth, but to poverty, not to status, but to lowliness and even accepting insults, not to pride, but to humility, not to independence, but to dependence on Christ and one another. Poverty, insults, humility, dependence. A lot of fun, huh? You can see why Lucifer's battle flag is more attractive. But also, as we will recognize from throughout the Christian tradition, we know that following the standard of Lucifer leaves us empty, unsatisfied, and alone, while the standard of Christ leaves us joyful, gives us meaning, relationships, love. Now, of course, so we don't have to go to the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, the Catholics. The Jesuits don't own this kind of an idea. If you look back to the book of Genesis, we'll also see simple, basic theme from the very beginning. We're made for harmony and relationship, right? Now starts out so nice. In the garden, we're in harmony with God, with each other. Last time a married couple, in my experience, didn't bicker, right? And with the natural world. A little bit like San Diego, only better. Not like Chicago so much. Sin, of course, breaks those relationships. And we end up in disharmony with ourselves. Married couple blaming each other. Man, that sounds more like it. It was your fault. You should have turned left there. God distant, and of course, no longer at peace with nature. Sin breaks relationships at all levels. which is why for Dante, as you remember the Inferno, at the very bottom, there is the devil frozen, caught, trapped in his aloneness. Okay, so these two standards, I think, standard of Christ, standard of Lucifer, are deep in Pope Francis's experience, his formation, his spirituality, and I think that's, although it's a biblical theme as well, it's the two standard version of it that structures his thought and that pushes him to take up some common themes from a slightly more radical angle, an angle a little more appropriate to seeing them under these two standards. So that's what I'm going to try to do. It's a brief time here. I want to talk about a couple, let's see, 4 interrelated issues, and try to show how seeing it through this idea of the way the modern world is confronting us with the standard of Christ and the standard of Lucifer can help us see what Francis is thinking about and how it all to him fits together. That he's not just trying to answer everything, but trying to get at what the standard of Lucifer is for us today. What's the temptation? And where will that lead us? So I'm going to talk about the option for the poor, as that is especially developed in his work, the specific criticisms of global capitalism as an idolatrous economy, migrants or migration, an issue that's been very important to him, and care for the natural environment, care for nature, because the choice between Christ and Lucifer is never a private, personal choice only. It is a choice we each make personally, but it's a choice that affects all of society, all of our relationships. Okay, so let me start with the option for the poor. The concept, as you all, I think, seem to know it very well from looking at your worshiping with you. You got that one. Developed originally as a term, though it's deep in the Christian tradition, by liberation theology, affirmed by the Latin American bishops in Puebla, Mexico, as part of church teaching, and then finally taken up into the theology and writings of the Pope John Paul II in one of his encyclicals. Basic idea, nicely put by Francis, by the way. God loves everyone, of course, but God goes first to the poor, the vulnerable, the insignificant, the left out, the excluded, the oppressed. And we should be open and loving of everyone, but we also should opt first for the poor, the excluded, the oppressed. Pope Francis has argued that society must make an option for the poor. This isn't limited to a religious choice. That the church must make an option for the poor, and that each individual person, each individual Christian to be Christian, must make a personal option for the poor. And I think here's where we see that this isn't just the usual option for the poor, it is that, but it comes under the choice between the standard of Christ or the standard of Lucifer. When, for example, in talking about society making an option for the poor, he argues that justice is so integral to society and mutual care of one another is the basis of civilization. So that if we don't care for each other, if we don't establish justice for the poor as a society, our society will end up not only being empty and meaningless, but in fact destroying itself. Mutual care is the basis of civilization. When you stop caring for one another, civilization frays and society breaks down. So the question maybe isn't, can we afford to do better in caring for the poor and others in need, but can we afford not to? An interesting argument, by the way, that violence results from social injustice, not just because the poor and the excluded are angry, frustrated, and desperate, although there is that. Crime rates do tend to go up when poverty rates go up, but also because people don't respect unjust structures and social forms. If there isn't efforts towards greater justice there, even those who benefit from the injustice don't really respect the social institutions or the law, which is an interesting argument. I haven't seen that a lot in previous things, but it does, I think, make some important kind of points and probably says something about why we have so much corporate corruption, even if their laws are leading them to benefit from society. Moving into the church, the poor should be at the center of the church in work for justice, in witness and evangelizing. So other people have argued this. He does something interesting, though, in pointing out that sometimes pastorally, the poor don't get the pastoral care they deserve and need either. I was thinking, as I come from, as a lot of you know, we talk a lot about food deserts, neighborhoods, but he's actually noted there are not only food deserts, at least in terms of established churches, there's often pastoral deserts. And what does that say about where our values are? Right? So again, following through the two standards thing, knowing that the standard of securing yourself first leads to destruction, he argues that a church without an active option for the poor, no matter how much they talk about it, no matter how many, he actually says this, no matter how many forums you have on social justice, if you're not out there doing something, the church is going to break down, it's going to spiritually die, it's going to lose itself in empty talk, because that's where the standard of Lucifer leads. He's actually, and this is an image worth bringing up because I think many of you probably know it better than I do. He keeps talking in different contexts. I've seen it more than once. He prefers a church that's bruised and broken, hurting from being out in the world, to one that is sick from being enclosed. And it's an interesting metaphor, but I think what he's after is, I think we all know, if we participate in churches, that there's a fear of going out for all sorts of reasons. It's easier to stay in secure establishment, and I think that may be what he's talking about, risking the bruises, the battering, to live the gospel. Okay, now this is the personal option for the poor, I think, is one of the real signature contributions that Francis has made, if anybody listens to it, because he's declared that no one is too busy to be personally involved with the poor. All should be actively committed. Now, and sorry about that. The usual reaction is like, really? Even if our hearts are in the right place, right? I mean, can't I do my work? I teach. Can't I just teach and let that trickle down? He's saying no. I mean, think about, there's no outsourcing your option for the poor. We can't get other people to do it for us, which is kind of a drag, right? Because it's easier to outsource that one. And then you think about, well, a lot of people say, but look, I do important work. I'm busy. I don't have time to make sandwiches for the soup kitchen. But I think Francis is asking us to really think about that. Would we be Christians and say we couldn't find an hour to pray, go to church at least occasionally? Can we be Christians then if we can't find the time to reach out to excluded people? An hour a week, an hour a month, something that brings us into contact with real people who are suffering from their lack of contact. And one of the things I've actually, just because of some work, my husband is in the Episcopal Cathedral of San Diego, and some work from his church, which is, have any of you been to San Diego? Balboa Park is this huge jewel of San Diego, and the Episcopal Cathedral is right across the street from it. This jewel of a park, which attracts millions of visitors a year, is also home for many homeless people. So the church has developed a ministry, and one of the stunning things to find if you take some time to talk to the homeless, as I'm sure many of you have already done, or all of you are doing, a lot of people are starved for recognition of their humanity. Love to tell their story to somebody. Love to be recognized and part of the community. Those of you who have experienced that, get out and tell people, because other people don't know that. They think those scary people don't want to talk to us, because those scary people are used to being insulted and shunted aside. Okay, in any case, what you see throughout Francis's option for the poor is that, like the standard of Christ, we're called to love, give, share, rebuild relationships with the most excluded. And that results in a meaningful and joyful life. What we're tempted is to put wealth, security, our business, our success first, and that leads to violence, emptiness, meaninglessness, and spiritual death. So the two standards there. We can be self-focused or other-focused. Okay, I'm going to move now to the what starts to get more really pointed when he talks about the idolatry of global capitalism. A lot of people will note he's made sharp criticisms. Trickle-down theory of economics doesn't work. There's no evidence to support it. The economy's unjust and destructive. He's also gotten sharp pushback from people who say he's gone too far. Many people have pointed out, most of what he's saying, that's not all that new. Benedict criticized capitalism. John Paul II criticized capitalism. We have over 100 years of Catholic social teaching. He's in a long line of criticizing unjust economies. But I think he pushes the criticism a little further in a couple of respects. One is he's noticed that our new global economy doesn't just oppress the worker, it often has no need for people. They've gone from being oppressed to excluded. There's no people that exceed what the economy needs to function, therefore become valueless. We see this on a global level, and we see it kind of locally with our homeless, the people without economic value. They're not just working hard to survive, they have no place in society. We have put achieving profits over life. And another theme he's picked up from Father Gustavo Gutierrez in Liberation Theology, you see it also in Francis's writings, the economy of exclusion kills. Or as Gustavo Gutierrez wrote, in the final analysis, poverty means death. If you're poor, you don't have enough. You don't have the means you need to survive. The poor die before their time. And our economy of exclusion kills spirits as well as bodies. People who are denied a place in society and the spirits of the people who deny them, as some of your prayers so nicely pointed out. So, as is to be expected from following the standard of Lucifer in a global economy seeking wealth, status, and privilege, this economy's emphasis on profits over people leaves us empty with greedy, covetous hearts. But he's going to go even a little further when he calls it idolatrous. Although, again, this fits the logic, because if you're following the standard of Lucifer, you followed another god, another set of values. So he's saying we're following we don't just have an unjust economy, we've made a false god of our economy. Couple of examples that he points out. It's often the highest unquestioned common value in our society. We don't even debate whether we want economic progress. We assume that the question is how to get there, how to get a growing economy at all costs. It's often the highest value in our own lives as we live them. Again, I'm kind of reminded of Martin Luther, who said, "Show me how you live and I will tell you who your God is." What do we spend our time on? Who dares to be an economic failure? Right? That's scary. This economy demands, like all false gods, sacrifices. The sacrifices of the lives of the left out, of the poor, of the common good, of our own time, energy, and family relationships, all sacrificed to appease the God of economic profit and success. So we have no time for those things that aren't profitable, like prayer, like church, like caring for people in need. And like all false gods, it takes away our freedom. The true God enlivens, gives us back our true selves. The false God, the standard of Lucifer, enchains us, makes us unfree. And this again, I think, makes some interesting parallels with the former Pope Benedict, who talked a lot about how Marxism denied people's freedom because it assumed that the economy, that history was going in a certain way that we didn't intervene in. France has now applied that to global capitalism. We think we have to leave it unregulated and let it do whatever it does to give us the goods we want. Really? We're no longer free? Who's in charge here? The invisible hand of the marketplace or human beings to create societies? So, in all of these ways, I think what you see is that this is clearly under the standard of Lucifer, not the standard of Christ. He's got an emphasis here on migration. So I got two more to go. Migration and nature, in case you're getting a little restless. The migration theme has been big in his pontificate since he started. His first trip out of Rome as Pope, I believe, was to Lampedusa, the island where a lot of immigrants are coming into Europe, off of the coast of Italy. And it was there, by the way, I've been told, that he first used the term the globalization of indifference. In looking at migrants, people dying or trapped there, to get there or trapped there. He's identified, in fact, a special concern for migrants in his address to the U.S. Congress, if you look at that, in his work recently in Mexico, talking about immigration and the wall, and also in his address to the diplomatic corps in the Vatican, which is, they tell me, how you know what the Vatican's agenda for the year is. You see what he says to the diplomatic corps, and it was about migration. Could be in part because he's the son of immigrants himself. His parents came to Argentina from Italy. He is, as he said, the pastor of a church without borders, so that makes him more, perhaps, attentive to the movements of people and the rights of all people. But I think especially this issue comes up because this is a particular crisis right now. We're both in one of those times of extreme population movement and especially an unprecedented level of refugees. According to Francis, we haven't had this many refugees since World War II. Also, this is part, of course, of the option for the poor. Migrants are among the most vulnerable of the poor. They've lost their homes, they've lost their communities, many lose family in the process. They have lost resources, nearly all their possessions. These are often the face of the disposable poor, the people who don't have enough economic value to matter. Because as I told my kid when she announced that if she doesn't get her way in this election, she's moving to Canada, You can't actually do that. They won't necessarily let you in unless you have a really high-paying job. On the other hand, I told her she can repatriate. She's Mexican, so now she's looking south. You have to have economic value, right, to get into other countries. The people at the border are not the wealthy. If Justin Bieber wants to move to Canada, actually he's Canadian. Justin Bieber wants to move to Germany, they'll probably let him do so. The migrants and refugees left in these camps are the disposable people, the ones who have no place in society. And he notes the interesting system we have. Capital can cross borders, profit can cross borders, natural resources can cross borders in this global system, but those who are left disposable can't cross borders. So he calls on the states, again, to balance their concern for the rights of citizens with their obligation to people beyond their borders, because mutual care is the basis of civilization. A self-enclosed society will not be secure, but will self-destruct because it's following empty values. And again, pushing the envelope a little here, he called on all the churches in Europe, each one to take in a family of refugees or forfeit their tax-exempt status because he said they're not religious. Yeah, you can make that. Them's fighting words. Which sounds extreme, but again, if you think back, standard of Christ, standard of Lucifer, it's a forced option. We don't get a both and on this one. As much as Catholics like both and, you don't get both Lucifer and Christ. You don't get first wealth, status, security, and then we'll be okay with God because we'll throw a little bit of our extra change to the poor. And it works for churches too. We can't do all of our internal religious stuff first and then eventually maybe share a little bit with those in need. If Christ is among the poor, if God goes first to the poor, we follow Christ by going first to the poor and talking about it even. Again, with the churches, talking about it isn't enough. We've got to find a way to each of them take in a family, he says, or they are not religious. And on the way to spiritual death and destruction anyway, because of the standard. The fourth category I want to talk about then is the option for the poor and nature. This is really a game changer. He is the first and he's written the first entire encyclical devoted to the environment and care for nature. He also argues that nature is among the poor, the vulnerable, the weak, the victims of a global economy that sacrifices everything to profit. Right? The global economy uses up anyone or anything of value and disposes or wastes of anyone or anything that is no longer of value. Or as he also says, the vulnerable and weak, including the poor, cannot resist the false god of the global economy. So just see if I can get his high points here so we can see what you all want to talk about. Of course, he calls us to act to end global warming, stop the destruction of nature, loss of species. He reminds us of the moral imperative to not use up what other people need. Right? So water is a right. It's necessary for life. We have no right to waste what other people need to live. But he's taking the argument beyond human well-being, although that is there. We should care for the environment because the poor suffer from the destruction of the environment because we're using up the resources for the future. It's not good for us. But he also has said nature has value in itself. He warns us of a tyrannical anthropocentrism.
Tyrannical what?
Anthropocentrism, putting human beings first above nature. This is unusual, I think. And his argument for it, that nature has intrinsic value not just for human purposes. It's created by God, who called it good. We all know that from Genesis. And nature praises God in its diversity. We have no right to drive species into extinction. So again, of course, we see the greed-oriented with nature, the greed-oriented standard of Lucifer versus the relational love standard of Christ affecting the environment. And general, what I think is running throughout is that Pope Francis sees a world of lonely, empty people. He said at one point he'd like to free people of the unworthy chains of empty, self-centered loneliness. We're empty people sacrificing the poor, sacrificing migrants, sacrificing nature, sacrificing our own lives to a false idol that entices with promises of wealth and power. Instead, and this came up especially in his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, there's a better way. We could be living richer, fuller, freer, more joyful lives, following the standard of Christ. Now, this, I think, is my closing part here, to your relief. This is where mercy comes in. He declared this is the year of mercy. Because guess what? As stark as the option is between these two standards, we fail, right? We choose the wrong standard over and over. We do it as a society. We do it as churches. We do it in our personal lives. We try to have it both ways. That's what we really do, right? We don't go all the way with it. We'll do mostly care for wealth and success, and then we'll do the other as well. Of course, that doesn't work. We can't seek wealth and status and then come back to the standard of Christ at the same time. It's one or the other, ultimately. Putting the community, the whole, first, and finding ourselves in love, or putting ourselves first and finding we've lost ourselves and our community. Fortunately, God never tires of forgiving. This is this theme of mercy. And he had a story where somebody said to him, "Oh, Father, if you'd known what I'd done, you couldn't say that. You couldn't say God will forgive." He said, "All the better. The more you've sinned, the more happy God is to forgive you." Almost sounds Lutheran there, doesn't he? We are continually called back in our failures, in our efforts at the both and, by a merciful God who will always forgive, always empower us to start again. And this is the year of mercy for a people facing some stark choices between a world following the standard of Lucifer and a world following the standard of Christ. I think he wants to embody all of this in the name he took, St. Francis of Assisi, right? St. Francis, if you know anything about this wonderful Italian saint, he chose the wrong standard and literally went into battle, but he then repented and wholeheartedly chose the standard of Christ, exemplifying exactly the virtues and behaviors Pope Francis is calling us to. Francis of Assisi, you just say the name and people think. Poverty, humility, simplicity, love of the poor, and love of nature, of creation. Perhaps most of all, of course, St. Francis is known for his joy, which is, I think, the final image that Pope Francis wants us to remember. So I think you guys have been listening very patiently. Thank you so much. Do you want to ask some questions or make some comments or share some of your insights? You don't need to clap. We'll clap later. Does anybody have any parts that weren't clear, or you want to share some of your own insights? Sir.
I appreciate everything you said.
Wow.
I think you left out one thing that I'd like to have you communicate back to Pope Francis.
He doesn't talk to me regularly, but
We come together your lead to do this, and to me, this is one of the more important things that we do. And each time I go away and we remain fragmented as Christians, I wish in some way Pope Francis could deal with the brokenness of the Christian community. I think that's our poverty in terms of who we are.
Go ahead, yeah, I'll say more when I've said plenty, I'll say more.
Yo hablo español. Estoy cómodo para la primera vez después de 30 años escuchando a Papa Francis en su lengua original.
Ah, how
I
nice.
speak Spanish, and I've been with International Catholics for 40 years. And this is the first time I've heard a Pope in Spanish. Now, when he's translated into English, you don't get the nuances. He's more radical than the polite Vatican translator wants to choose. Now, at the same time, it's accurate.
Yeah.
But John Francis Burke, who's a native of Bethlehem, just wrote a book. He's a graduate of Notre Dame, and he returned to the area. I got to know John, and he's written a book, Building Bridges, Not Walls, Construyendo Puentes, No Construimos Muros. In any case, he said something in his book that really touched me as a bilingual Protestant. He said that there's a difference in the religious imagination and between Anglos and Latinos. And that's certainly true in a lot of Latino customs, which I'm not in favor of in the Catholic community, but Burke's book addresses those as strengths, which is a challenge to me. But that tension is very much present in the Lehigh Valley when you look at the Latino community closely, as I've been forced to from growing up with it. However, what he says, Burke says, is that this religious imagination of the Hispanic community is a resource. And I think that that's very prevalent in Pope Francis's writing. And we miss it when we don't have Hispanic.
I'm going to say a couple of things, I think, to both of us. I'll try not to talk too much so you all have a chance. But yes, thank you for that. I've noticed in my neighborhood, they put up billboards with Pope Francis's sayings in Spanish about welcoming the immigrant, although they sign his name in Italian. And so it shouldn't be, it's Francisco, not Francesco. But I don't know why they do that. You're right. One thing.
He's trilingual. He knows
At
the
least.
Italian too.
Yes. You might want to consider, in terms of seeing the positive in Latino religious practices, which come from Latin America. There's some relation with Latinos, not exactly Latin American. There's a wonderful book called San Fernando Cathedral about the work that recently deceased Father Virgilio Elizondo did in showing in San Antonio the power and beauty of what he felt were his neglected traditions and making it public. So that would be something, if you can get a hold of that book, it's very moving. But you're right, there are, as well, lots of resources to share. That'll be the topic later, when I come back after. Just in response to what you said, then I'll get you real briefly. Yes, absolutely. We'll talk more about that tonight, but I think Francis, I mean, you could find, he's making some headway, often by example. I noticed that repeatedly he will do things like ask people to pray for him, or simply, if prayer is not what they do, to wish him well. Or he will offer blessings. So he's actually, for the first time, acknowledging with Italian reporters that they may not be Catholic, or they may not share the same faith, and he'll say, kind of go down the line, in the pray as Catholics or as Christians or whatever religion or of none. So I think he's demonstrating in his humility something of the respect that has to be the basis.
And he washed the feet of Muslim women.
And he washed the feet of Muslim women. And I think it was probably the women part that gave people more conniption fits. I'm sorry, you wanted to say?
Nothing like a pope that gives conniption fits. It's been said that the Protestant tradition is often kind of cafeteria Christianity, that we take what we like and leave the rest on the table. I think that's probably very true, not just of Protestant Christians, and I claim that error. But boy, I'm finding an awful lot of the feast that he is offering. Something I want on my tray as I go through the line. The question I have is, you spelled out the two flags idea of Lucifer and Christ. Is there that within Francis' writings or thought that picks up the idea, I think it was probably in Neo-Orthodoxy, that suggests while there are those two sides, that the battle is not equal?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I didn't hear it in your presentation.
You're right.
I just wanted
Because
to...
it's just, I was focusing on the choice for us.
Mhm.
And I think that's what he's focusing on, right? What are we choosing in our lives? Obviously, and this is, of course, why God can forgive, right? The mercy that can always call us back, because ultimately God is in control and God is merciful. But we sure can mess things up in ways we shouldn't be. And mess our own lives up. So it was kind of, yeah, it'd be interesting to trace that further through, but I probably won't right now. Does anybody else want to? Please.
Well, I'm David. I'm working with the Spanish community. I always have learned that a divided church cannot serve a broken community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things on the conference that we are to learn is how can we connect with each other and see the vision of Pope Francis, just trying to, like you said, trying to consume everything, trying to give us an example that as he speaks, we can be the endurers of everything that we do if we are willing to share the vision together. And this is one thing that I have learned in his comments as I look at it from time to time in his visit, that he was trying to share the vision because he has seen how America, starting from the politics, have divided our nation in different thought and perspective. And we're not looking at the people who not just poor in spirit, but poor in broken homes. Mm-hmm. And I believe there's something that as we got together in conference like this, that we can embrace the message of love and continue to go forward. And it was very nice what you had.
Oh, thank you very much. Please.
I thought it was nice he preached in Spanish in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And walking through the halls or the streets of Philadelphia to hear the words in Spanish, and recognizing a significant minority in Philadelphia and everywhere in the United States. I'm sure it was just easier. It gets tired. It makes me work harder when I have to speak in my second language. Yeah. I'm more tired, but nevertheless, I thought it was just beautiful to hear Spanish down the streets of Philadelphia as he was preaching.
This is shading a little bit into what I'm going to say later, but I wasn't going to put this example, so I'll throw this out. My daughter's public school in California runs its PTA meetings bilingually. They just do. The principal is bilingual, and when parents get up to speak, if they speak in Spanish, somebody will jump up and translate who knows English. If they speak in English, somebody will jump up and translate who knows Spanish. And I'm thinking, why do we say we don't have time in our churches to address each other? We have to be segmented in our day. Even occasionally, take the time, because what matters? Relationship. If the public school system can take the time to be bilingual, to affirm and bring people together at the same event, maybe we don't have to have 2 and 3 separate linguistic communities in the same church building. Maybe we could be one in our differences. But that's the topic for later.
Thank you.
But thank you. Okay, I bet people want dinner.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you all very much. You're good. Audience.